Hey, everybody. I'm so excited about the podcast this week because my friend Bryan Stevenson is going to be joining us. Bryan, how are you? How nice to see you again. How are you?
I'm well. It's great to see you too.
I also, I probably should, I have a room very similar to the one you're in with a lot of books that I am also reading right now to educate.
I have no doubt. I have no doubt. You probably have like a whole library, like big buildings and things to kind of reflect the books you've read. I have no doubt about that.
Bryan, it's very similar to, if you remember, Beauty and the Beast, where he had just books and books. It's really all I do with my time because learning is so important to me, Bryan.
It is. It is. It is.
How have you been, man? Where are you right now?
I'm in my office in Montgomery, Alabama,
Okay.
and being in Montgomery without traveling for almost 2 years has been really kind of a revelation just because you just learn things about yourself in terms of when you're just in the same bed every night. It's been great. But the most amazing thing for me has been just thinking about the people here more. I mean, during this last 2 years, I've come to appreciate how much I'm standing on the shoulders of people, who did so much more with so much less. I've thought a lot more about that generation that came before me in Montgomery, who would put on their Sunday best and they would go places to push for basic rights. And they'd be on their knees praying, and they knew that they were going to get battered and bloodied and beaten, and yet they still went. And you think about that, or I've been thinking about that just because I've been here every day for the last couple of years. And it's made me even more energized and committed to try to do the work, we're trying to do.
It's amazing work that you're doing. Is that what inspired you to get into it in the first place? When you talk about the kind of legends of Alabama and Montgomery and Selma and all throughout the South and the North, and the abolitionists. What was it about them that so inspired you? Was it that sense of the dignity of nonviolence in the face of violence? What got you in the first place?
Yeah, I definitely think it was their sense of mission and purpose that they did things that they didn't have to do for themselves, but they felt obligated to do for other people. I grew up in a community where Black kids couldn't go to the public schools, started my education in a colored school. There were no high schools in our county when my dad was a teenager. And even though my dad was hardworking and smart, he didn't get the opportunities that other people got. And then these lawyers came into our community, made them open up the public schools. And that's how I got to go to high school and college and law school. And the thing that I never forgot about that was that if you had a vote on whether to racially integrate the schools in my county, we would have lost the vote. The county was 80% white. But these lawyers had the power to make them do something they would not otherwise do by complying with the rule of law. And that kind of power really excited me because I never felt like we were going to persuade everybody to think the right way about everything.
Right.
And that really did motivate me to see both civil rights activism, but in particular, the law and the rule of law as a tool for advancing the rights of disfavored people, marginalized people, people who lived in spaces where they were unseen and unheard. And I've been even more inspired by it, as we've gotten deeper into this work.
I'm struck by, you tell a story like that and you sort of expect, we're going to trot in the 98-year-old old grandpa, years ago. I mean, you're a young man. The fact that this was occurring in the United States, even within your lifetime, and that the law was a necessary lever by which you had to force people to allow that I think it's shocking to people.
It is shocking. And I think that's one of the mistakes I think, make today is we don't understand how we are in the very early days of a post-apartheid era in this country. I mean, African people came here over 400 years ago, and throughout most of that history, they were enslaved, they were terrorized by lynching, they were legally segregated and barred. We're in the very early days of this post-apartheid era. I'm not 100 years old, but when I was born, many states in this country banned interracial marriage. And you could not go to public schools. You could not go to the movies in interracial settings. And we're just beginning to reckon with that history. And the critical thing, of course, was the laws changed in the 1960s, but the thinking has still not changed in a lot of spaces. And so we're still wrestling with all of these dominant attitudes and ideas that have dominated American history. So you're right. We're in a very early phase of this period of time when it was legal to exclude people based on color and race.
Bryan, you're dangerously treading on critical race theory, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave the room right now. We're going to have to shut this down right away. This brings up an interesting point, Bryan, because this is, we just taped an episode for the show on race, the idea being, after George Floyd, there was this idea of, we're going to have a racial reckoning, as though that was, a shock to the system for Americans of like, hey, do we have a racial issue in this country? It just appeared to everybody. And white people very clearly were like, I think we're going to sit back and listen. It's time. And so we just ran sort of African Americans saying pretty much the same thing from 2020 all the way back to Frederick Douglass. I mean, basically, the message is remarkably consistent over time. And it's not a question of it not being said or people not listening. There are structural and emotional things in place that are preventing the dominant culture in America from accepting either responsibility. I don't know if it's resentment based on an accusation that seems attacking your morality. I don't know if it's resource guarding. The faces of the white people that Ruby Bridges faced when she went to school, and the faces of, the Little Rock kids when they went to school, and the faces of Boston busing, and the faces of Upper West Side sophisticated liberals when their school is being integrated. Man, it's the same face, and it's the same anger, and it hasn't changed. Where do you see, how do you begin to not just legislate, but make real progress beyond that?
Yeah, I think it's an important insight, John. And I think you've characterized it really effectively. We have never really contended with the narrative of racial difference that we have all inherited. If you live in this country, you live in a space where the air has been polluted by, contaminated by these narratives that have been shaped over centuries. And it doesn't matter whether you live in Boston or Alabama or Los Angeles, no matter where you go, you're in a space where there are these narratives that undermine our ability to look at each other in a healthy and whole way. And some people have argued that at some point they'll dissipate, but I don't believe that. These are the kinds of contaminants that you have to address. And I think we're in this place because we haven't talked about things we need to talk about. We've had this evolution of history, but we actually haven't had a conversation about this narrative of racial difference, this narrative of racial hierarchy that we were given. We've never really talked in this country about the fact that we're a post-genocide society. I think what happened to indigenous people when Europeans came to this continent was a genocide because millions, tens of millions were killed through famine and war and disease. And rather than talk about it through the language of genocide, we created a narrative of racial difference to justify all of that death and violence. We said those native people, they're savages. Mm-hmm. And we used that narrative of racial difference to exclude them from the liberty and justice that we were codifying in our Constitution and Declaration. Then we used that same narrative of racial difference to justify 2.5 centuries of slavery. And the great evil of slavery for me wasn't the involuntary servitude and the forced labor. The real evil of slavery was the narrative of racial difference that we created to justify enslavement, because enslavers wanted to feel moral and just and Christian. And so they created this narrative that Black people aren't as good as white people. Black people aren't fully evolved. Black people are less capable, less worthy, less deserving. And that narrative of racial difference, that was the true evil of American enslavement. And we fought the Civil War, and the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war because that idea of racial difference, of racial hierarchy, of white supremacy, it persisted after the Civil War, which is why I've argued that slavery doesn't end. It just evolves. It turns into a century
Right.
of mob violence and
Because
lynching.
the pathology within it has never dissipated. Brian, this gets to a great point. Maybe this could be instructive. I can walk you through some of the pushback that occurs when that's brought up. And this is something that happened on the show we did. And I want to get your opinion on the various levels of push. I call them the butt people, the people that watched what happened to George Floyd and said, oh, that was terrible. But, and it was either that's not all law enforcement, or he was a particularly, vagrant and drug addicted fella, and all the buts that occur from, and I'm not talking about the extremes of the country, the tiki torch marching, Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us folks. That's not really why we can't get racial progress. Racial progress strikes me as the majority of white people that consider themselves moral, slavery is not on their hands, certainly. So I want to address the things that come up. So first and foremost is always, we don't have slavery. We don't have segregation. So we've knocked down those barriers. So why are we still talking about it? It's a meritocracy.
Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of frame things in ways that people can understand. But the truth is, we still do have a very segregated society in this country. We never did address the legacy of 100 years of disenfranchising Black people from the end of the Civil War until the 1960s, even though we have a Constitution that guarantees the right to vote to every American citizen, even though it was illegal and unconstitutional, we allowed Black people to be largely disenfranchised for a century. We allowed Black people to be pulled out of their homes and beaten and drowned and lynched. And you didn't have to participate in the mob to be responsible for that kind of mob violence, because everyone in America was comfortable in abandoning the rule of law while thousands of Black people were being lynched and terrorized. And the demographic geography of this country was shifting, right? The 6 million Black people that fled the American South, that went to Cleveland and Detroit and Los Angeles and Chicago, went to these communities as not as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities, but as refugees and exiles from terrorism. And we were comfortable with all of that. And then when we passed the laws in the 1960s, we said, we're done. And so the reason why we are still dealing with it is because we haven't reckoned with the damage. And this is the thing that's so perplexing. American society is a society that believes if you hurt someone, if you damage something, you owe them a repair. You can't damage my car on the interstate and then just drive. It's a tort, right? It's a tort.
It's driven. That's our entire legal system.
If you go to,
is based on harm.
It's based on harm. Law school is dominated by courses on remedies and repair, et cetera. But in the context of civil rights and racial justice, we have never talked about repair. We just said to those states that disenfranchised Black people for a century, don't do that anymore. I wouldn't need to be a criminal defense lawyer if our notion, after you commit a crime, burgle someone, rob someone, is that you go someplace and they say, don't do that anymore. We won't accept that. And
it's illegal now, so you don't have to worry about it.
And that's the harm. I think that is the reason why we have made so little progress. And because the people in power are the people who are obligated to make the repair. I talk a lot about what happened in South Africa after the collapse of apartheid, and they have a truth and reconciliation process. I talk a lot about what we've seen in Europe, in Germany in particular, where when you go to Berlin, you see a completely different architecture and landscape. You can't go 200 meters in Berlin without seeing markers and stones that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families. It is a landscape that screams reckoning and reconciliation and repair. And because of that, there are no Adolf Hitler statues in Germany. It'd be unconscionable to try to memorialize the perpetrators of the Holocaust. But in this country, the landscape is littered with iconography celebrating those who perpetuated an enslavement. And so in the 1960s, what we should have done after the passage of the Voting Rights Act is to say now, because these states have resisted providing voting rights to Black people for so long, we're going to make you do some things that evidence repair. I don't think it would have been wrong or inconsistent to say, if you're a black person in a state that has historically disenfranchised black people, you don't even have to register to vote. The state is obligated to register you when you become of age. I don't think it would have been wrong to say, we'll come get your vote as an act of reckoning with 100 years of disenfranchisement and intimidation.
Right.
But instead of doing that, we empowered the same people who had disenfranchised people to come up with new tactics to minimize black voting. And that's continued till today. Yeah.
The key has been that through every advancement, there's been a clever mutation that has slowly, back in the South, imagine letting people out of slavery and then not giving them any means and then immediately saying, you know what we're going to do? We're going to pass a law to suggest that vagrancy and loitering, white people in the South, they don't loiter. They sashay, they amble, but they don't loiter. That's set aside. And so every time power was gained, another mutation occurred to dissipate that power, to knock the foundation of that power from gaining momentum.
That's right. And it sometimes even wasn't that clever. So you had 90% of the black population living in the American South, states where there were anti-literacy laws, where enslaved black people or free black people were barred from learning to read. And then once Reconstruction collapses, what do? We create all of these literacy tests that you have to pass to vote, which don't apply to white people. It didn't apply to you if your grandfather could vote before the end of the Civil War. And then once people became literate, and there were lots of black literate people, we have to manipulate the tests in ways to make sure that no one can pass. We have an exhibit in our museum. We've actually gone through and pulled questions from literacy tests that were being administered in the 1950s and 1960s during my lifetime.
Right.
And the questions are things like, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? How many seeds in a watermelon? How many windows in the White House? Count the number of jelly beans. And I guess what I'm saying is we were tolerating all of this. And the fundamental challenge that we have in America is that unlike South Africa, where a black majority took over and power shifted, unlike Germany, where the Nazis left the war, there hasn't been a shift of power in this country. And so we've been engaged in trying to persuade people to reckon with this history without the power that comes when you win a war, when you're dealing with a defeated foe.
Right.
And that's why Dr. King and all of those amazing civil rights advocates resorted to nonviolence. That's why we're using all of these different platforms, discourse and media and art and music and law. But ultimately, there has to be an awareness that we did something harmful, and we now have to make sure that we adequately remedy that harm, which is why I think we have to have an era of truth-telling that then leads to reconciliation and restoration. And the mistake, I think, sometimes is made that people scare folks into thinking that if you tell the truth, if you hear the truth, you won't survive. And I don't believe that. I actually, I come from a faith tradition, and in my church, you can't come in there and say, I want salvation and redemption, but I don't want to admit to anything. I don't want to own up to anything. They'll tell you it doesn't work like that. They'll actually say, no, the confession and repentance is key to the redemption and the salvation.
Oh, man. That's why, that's a tough one.
And I guess I feel like the moment we are in is going to require us to actually believe that there's something better waiting for us. And I do think there's something better waiting for us.
And that's what I want to get to, which I think is at the base of this, the emotional reaction to this issue. So 2 things. One is, if you really drill down on the biases and the way things are portrayed, I think white people believe that somehow black people are partially or wholly responsible for the condition of entrenched poverty or the condition of incarceration or any of those other things. And number 2 is, and if you try and remedy those things that occurred that are no longer systemic and structural, that it will come out of their pockets. So there's resentment and there's fear. And I would even say to you, Germany definitely handled it in a very different way, but they've got a pretty thriving neo-Nazi population. That to me feels like the key. How do you deal with the emotional part of it? The justice part of it just seems so obvious.
Yeah.
that something else is holding us back. And it feels like resource guarding or resentment or a feeling that, look at the way they talk about drugs in this country.
Yeah.
Crack is gangs and violence and these kids and single mothers and crack babies. And opioids is those poor folks they're just despairing.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right in that we haven't created sort of an emotional relationship to this history that allows us to see things as we should. I mean, what's interesting to me is that I can tell a story about someone who's treated terribly because of their race, right? Who's arrested, wrongly accused, put in an adult prison. I have a client spent 30 years on death row for a crime he did not commit, a man named Anthony Ray Hinton, and they presumed his guilt because of his race. He was poor, he didn't have the resources to get the help he needs. And because we have a legal system that too often treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent, he spends 28 years on death row in a 5x7 cell. 55 people are paraded past him and executed. Had evidence of his innocence that the state just would not respond to. Eventually win his release. And when he goes out and talks to people now, I think people feel deeply that he was wrong. They have an emotional connection to his pain and his suffering, and they understand it at that level. But they're not willing to step back from that and then to say, but there were prosecutors and judges that were responsible for that.
That it was a system. Everybody looks at it as a one-off. George Floyd, that was terrible. But people won't go that place of, the analogy I like to do is the pandemic.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe we don't have racism, capital R now, but we're still testing positive.
Yeah.
We still have the antibodies.
Yeah.
And those structures, it's so hard to get people to admit that the system that was built is still felt today, that those issues compounded.
That's right. But I guess that's where we just haven't done the kind of careful thinking that we need to do. If you can't understand the climate issue without understanding that it's our whole history that has created this space where the global warming is taking place, where the caps are melting. It's not just something that happened, 100 years ago. It's what we're doing today. It is a collective history that allows these things to happen. And that's true when you talk about regional issues and land issues across the world. There are whole histories behind it. Well, that's true in this country. Like I said, my dad couldn't go to high school in our county. He worked in a food factory. He was just as smart and hardworking as a lot of other people. When he died, he didn't have land and money to give to his children. We inherited debt, and it wasn't because he didn't work hard. He was a really hardworking person. He fought in the Korean conflict, but when he came back from the Korean War, he couldn't get loans through the GI Bill because banks didn't give loans to Black veterans. They gave loans to white veterans, and they could build homes in the suburbs.
The New Deal. Black people were excluded from the New Deal. The Homestead Act. I mean, you can roll back the way to the beginning.
That's right. But those things have long-term consequences for lots and lots of people. And that's what we have to understand when we talk about systems and when we talk about structures. And that's why, in fact, I think we need institutions to begin doing repair work. Hospitals and schools and media that contributed, lynching was largely a consequence of the way media tolerated mob violence and vigilantism. They legitimated that kind of conduct. And some of those same media outlets today don't understand why they are criticized for some of their coverage. But there hasn't been that reckoning. There hasn't been that reckoning in business. There hasn't been. So I think that's part of it, is that once we understand the nature of the problem, we know that the problem isn't just levels of crime or poverty or despair. It is the way in which we have created this system, this structure that is non-responsive to wrongdoing, to harmfulness. You can't pour toxins into a river for 50 years and then stop and say, I don't owe anybody anything, even though you can't fish in that river. You can't swim in that river. That's the kind of thinking that we have to understand if we're going to make progress.
I think the river analogy actually resonates with me also because it's not a malevolent racism necessarily, but it's an inertia.
That's right. No, I think the cultural landscape of this country says a lot about how we have failed. And it does require intentionality. It does
Right.
require a willingness to look past these old modes, which haven't been very good. And I think the same has been true. You can look at gender. You can look at a lot of other issues that until the narrative
Absolutely.
shifts, there was a time when when I was growing up, a woman who was being abused by her spouse, if she called the police, she didn't have an expectation that that man was going to be arrested because police didn't take domestic violence seriously. They might pull the person out of the house. They weren't going to arrest that person. And then we had to kind of get people to begin understanding the harm. And media can be powerful. I remember when Farrah Fawcett made a movie called A Burning Bed.
Sure,
And
sure.
she inhabited this role and it changed the way people started thinking about that. And so when
Right.
the narrative shifted, the response shifted. We didn't have harsh punishments for people who were arrested for driving under the influence. It wasn't something you encouraged, but it wasn't something that you, quote, ruined someone's life over or put them in
Right.
prison for.
Right.
And then Mothers Against Drunk Driving began that campaign where they allowed their pain and their suffering and the harm of tolerating driving while intoxicated. And that's when the law began to shift. And now we have a very different attitude about that offense than we did before that narrative shift takes place. It's happening now around sexual harassment and sexual violence in the workplace. It shifts when the harm becomes known and expressed and accessible to people. And we begin thinking differently, talking differently, and behaving differently. And unfortunately, we haven't had that kind of shift when it comes to racial injustice, when it comes to racial violence,
Right.
which is why that moment in 2020 when the police officer is literally snuffing the life out of George Floyd, it's a little jarring. But if we don't understand the broader picture, the context, then it becomes a moment and not a movement. Which is why that is why cultural leaders and media and art and music has such a critical role to play. I think this is ultimately a narrative struggle that has to be advanced in ways that it hasn't been, in my view.
That brings me to a point, and I want to get your feelings on this. One of the issues that happens is when you make the moral argument to people, walls go up because they refuse to believe that they would be party to a system that feels corrupt and corrosive and unjust. I'm not party to that. That's somebody else. My life is hard. I don't have privilege. I'm working hard. What if we were to shift that narrative from a moral argument almost to an efficiency argument, which would be this: we can't afford to lose human capital in this country. Entrenched poverty basically makes poverty for everybody. That productivity is what drives this country. And until we are able to bring, it's arid desert. And until we can irrigate that, until we can make that bloom, it brings all of us down. And can we make that argument to people that fixing this is actually in your economic interest, even as a struggling lower class white person,
Yeah.
or somebody who says they play by the rules and they don't get any of the breaks? How do we? Would that be an effective line of argument?
I think it will be effective for a lot of people. And I'm at the point in my kind of life and career where I'm open to all of the effective arguments. For a long time, I was arguing against mass incarceration, this over-incarceration of people in this country, because it was wrong, putting people in prison for, 80 years for writing a bad check, having no minimum age for trying children as adults was just wrong. I kept saying, look, we talk as if we can put crimes in jails and prisons. We can't put a crime in jail or prison. We can only put a person in jail or prison. And people are not crimes. And so we have to think differently about this. And I made all of those arguments. But it's only when states didn't have the funding that they needed for education, for highways, for basic services, because all of it was being swallowed up by these prisons. It was only when we began to reckon with the billions of dollars that are being spent each year to incarcerate people that we began asking, well, does everybody that we have in prison need to be in prison?
That's right.
And then when we realized that we have hundreds of thousands of people who we could let out of prison tomorrow and our crime rate would not go up, would not be a threat to public safety, that you've seen a handful of states begin to make some progress and bring that down. And I do think we need to appreciate, again, the cost of allowing bias and bigotry and it's what I call the politics of fear and anger. And this is the challenge, though, that we face. We said that people who are drug addicted and drug dependent are criminals. That's what our politicians did, 50, 60 years ago. And
Although opioids, slightly different situation.
well, that it starts with, the people who use these things are criminal. And so we criminalize them, we put them in jails and prisons. And then all of a sudden, those laws begin to expand. And then we look at these other people and say, wait a minute, that's my son, that's my neighbor. Those are the people I know and trust. And then we begin to realize that it's not about criminality. It's an addiction. It's a dependency. It's about mental health. But my point is that when you allow yourself to be governed by fear and anger, which is what happens in politics, not just here, but all over the world. You go any place in the world.
And increasingly so, I
and
think,
increasingly
as
so.
we're adjusting to the modern media environment.
Absolutely. And because it's very effective. It's how you get likes. It's how you get attention.
It's how you get elected.
It's how you get elected.
Right.
And that puts you at risk of then tolerating things you would not otherwise tolerate, accepting things you would not otherwise accept. We've got 13 states in this country that have no minimum age for trying a child as an adult. And if you and I went to that legislature and said, surely you do not believe we should put 5- and 6-year-old children in adult prisons. Let's just make the law so that you cannot do that. We're going to have a hard time getting that law passed. We're going to have, and so I end up representing 10 and 11-year-old kids facing adult prosecution because we're tolerating something we should not tolerate because we don't want to be accused of being soft on crime or not tough or not. And that's what fear and anger will do. It will make you indifferent to the victimization of other people, hostile to correction and change, hostile to reform and justice, and make you complicit in creating the kind of society that we've seen too much of, where there's injustice and inequality, which is why I think part of getting people to that different emotional response is to get them to recognize that you can't actually be loving and kind and good if you're shaped entirely by fear and anger. Those are obstacles to healthy relationships. You don't marry people because you're afraid of them or because you're mad at them or because you have to. The lasting marriages come with some appreciation that you have to get past the mistakes. I tell people all the time, our aversion to saying, I'm sorry, I'm wrong, is going to limit the growth of this society because we can't get where we're trying to go if we're not willing to acknowledge that we make mistakes, that we fall down. You show me two people who've been in love for 50 years. I'll show you two people who've learned how to apologize when they've gone out of bounds, where they've made a mistake. And that's the dynamic of life and community.
But we've retreated from that type of engagement. And part of it is, I think, you've got this idea that the default setting, the factory setting in the United States is white, Christian, and male.
Yeah.
And so anything that deviates from the factory setting is an accommodation. Yeah. They are making an accommodation. And it comes back to this idea that because Black people have had to fight so hard for equality, and that was something that was allowed to be bestowed by the white power structure. So but it wasn't theirs to bestow. Mm-hmm. But if you feel like that's your ownership and that's the negotiation, economics is not even on the table yet. It's almost as though the fight for equality was allowed to go on so long as white people built equity. Mm-hmm. So wealth was able to compound over all those years, while the struggle to just be seen as human and forget about equal distracted from that. Yeah. And how do you address that idea that, to put it in its most blunt terms, was integration a failure? And should the Black community have been allowed like a Marshall Plan, so that when it raised to a certain level where it was no longer such a skewed negotiation, you actually had two parties that were facing each other on more solid and even ground?
Yeah. Well, there are certainly some who made that argument, Marcus Garvey and others. I just think that, when I think about my own kind of familial history, so my great-grandparents were enslaved in Caroline County, Virginia.
Your great-grandparents. So
great-grandparents. James and Victoria Baylor, born in the 1850s, enslaved, illegal to read, humiliated every day, denied basic freedom, could not do any of the things that a human being should be able to do. My great-grandfather learned to read, even though it could have cost him his life, because he had this belief that one day he'd be free. So as a person born in this country, he had to believe something he couldn't see, but he had that belief. When emancipation came, my grandmother told me that formerly enslaved people would come to their house every week, and my great-grandfather would stand up and read the newspaper so they would know what's going on. And these are communities of people who were working hard every day. They were building resources. They were building this country. They made this country progress. My grandmother's brother fought in World War I in a decorated troop that went to Europe and preserved the lives of people there, and then came back and was denied the freedom that he was fighting for over there. My grandparents fled to the north during that time of lynching. My parents were humiliated every day by those signs that said, white and colored. And yet, they never gave up on this country. They never gave up on working hard and buying into all these things. They thought their children might get to. So when you have that kind of investment, when you have people believing in an idea, we don't feel like we should give up on that. We don't feel like we should have to go away and see something.
It's not going away. It's given the chance to build the equity that they were denied in this country.
Even that, though, is a decision, a power that is in the hands of others. It does happen now. Right. You have people who have invested in Black, and that's why I think it's not only
the government hasn't in the way. I mean, if we spend $6 trillion rebuilding what we thought we destroyed in Afghanistan, why don't we spend $6 trillion rebuilding what we did destroy in America? We did destroy it.
That's exactly right. And that's why it is not wrong to invest in communities that have been damaged by our history and our structures. It's not wrong to prioritize Black banks and Black businesses and Black ownership that is trying to create some opportunity. But more fundamentally is we have to reckon with the harm that we have done, the wrong that we have done. Because I think most people, a lot of people in this country, if I bump into somebody and I knock them over and I hurt them, I'm going to feel bad. I'm not the kind of person that can just accidentally.
But also, though, Bryan, you're lovely. So that's that also, though, is, I don't know if you've met a lot of people here. But.
Well, my sense, though, is that we have, a lot of us, this need, this desire to feel right, to feel just, to feel more. Not everybody, but a lot of it. Even people who are doing things I fundamentally oppose, and they want to think they're actually right, that they're moral, that they're.
Do you engage those folks, Bryan? Are you someone that can engage them? And have you found ways and strategies that feel like you make progress in that arena?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a lawyer in Alabama. I go into courtrooms where my client and I are often the only people of color. You can't serve on a capital trial jury unless you support the death penalty. So I've had no choice but to engage people and to push people. And that's the lesson of Dr. King and the civil rights leaders. They use nonviolence to confront the immorality of assuming that you are better than other people. And that the optics of that were really powerful. So I have no choice but to go where the need is, because I know there are people who are more vulnerable than I am. I could move to another country. I could isolate myself in a space where I would less victimized by these harms. And people have done that for generations, Black folks and other folks. But I know that 1 in 3 Black male babies born in this country is going to end up in jail or prison unless things change. I know that the children of my children are going to still be burdened by the legacy of slavery in this country unless things change. I know that the hopelessness that condemns so many of the 12 and 13-year-old boys who tell me that they expect to be in jail or prison by the time they're 21 is going to persist unless things change. And because of that, I have to go wherever I can go to push things, to move things. And the powerful thing is that I do see it happening. We have this exhibit in our museum. We have these jars of soil that we put on shelves, and they're from lynching sites. And we had a middle-aged Black woman go to one of the sites, and she was nervous when she got there because it was in a remote location, it was on a dirt road. And she got to the site, she got down on her knees, she was going to start digging, and a pickup truck drove by, big white guy in the truck, stares at her, slows down, turns around, drives by again, stares at her some more, and she's terrified. Oh, sure. Then the man parks the truck, gets out, walks over to her, She says she decides she's not going to tell him what she's doing. She said she's just going to say she's getting dirt for a garden. Man walks up to her and says, "What are you doing?" And then she told me later, she said, "Mr. Stevenson, something got a hold of me." And I told that man, she said, "I'm digging soil because this is where a black man was lynched in 1937. I'm going to honor his life." She said, "It was just me and that big guy, but something got a hold of me." And she said, when she said that, the man just stood there. And then he said, "Does that paper you have talk about the lynching?" And she said, "Yes." And she gave the man the paper. He said, "Can I read it?" She said, "Yes." And he started reading the paper while she started digging. And the man finished reading the paper, and then he put the paper down, and he stunned her by saying, "Excuse me, ma'am, but would it be all right if I helped you?" And she said, "Yes." And he got down on his knees, and she offered him the implement to dig the soil. He said, "No, no, 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 I'll just use my hands." And this guy started throwing his hands into the soil and putting it in the jar, kept throwing his hands into the soil, and it blew her away. She said, "I had a tear running down my face. I just didn't expect it." And she said they got near the top, and she noticed that the man had slowed down, and she looked over at him, and she could see that his face was red. She could see his shoulders were shaking, and then she saw a tear running down his face, and she stopped. And she put her hand on his shoulder, and she said, "Are you all right?" And that's when the man said, "No, no, 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 I'm not all right." And he looked at her and he said, "I'm just so worried that it was my grandfather that participated in this lynching."
Oh, dear.
And she said they both sat there on this roadside weeping about the history, about the pain, about the suffering. She said, "Well, I'm going back to Montgomery to put this in the Legacy Museum at EJI." He said, "Would it be all right if I just followed you?" And I watched both of these people come in with that jar of soil. And I don't say that because I think beautiful things like that always happen when we do the truth telling, when we do the hard
Right.
work. But I
No, I
think
get that.
until we do the truth telling, until we do the hard work, we deny ourselves the beauty that is justice. And that's what I want to say to even the angriest white people, the angriest and most bitter people on these issues of race and justice. I want them to understand that there is something that feels more like freedom, more like equality, more like justice waiting for all of us.
Right.
But to get there, we have to have the courage to actually address the things that we are dealing with. Nobody takes chemotherapy and radiation because somebody offers it. Once you've been diagnosed with cancer, that's when you're willing to do these hard things. And we have to be willing to make the diagnosis even when people don't want to hear it. And that's the work of this for me. It's kind of saying the things sometimes people don't want to hear.
This is why I always, when I talk to you, I walk away feeling like we can do anything because it's so discouraging to watch it, and even the sense of engagement now is lost. You see in the current, and that's not to say that economic boycott and all kinds of other grassroots protests and all those things don't add up, because it does.
Yes.
And it oftentimes forces all kinds of change. But it seems like at its heart, it's two people with their hand in the dirt, joining together to right a wrong.
Yeah.
And it's such a, boy, it's hard to have that kind of retail justice, and the idea that, because it feels so incremental, and you want it to be profound, and you want it to be cataclysmic. You want this change to be something that we've waited so long to deal with it, and but you still seem so hopeful, and maybe it's not hope as much as it is necessity.
Well, it's both. I do feel like hope is critical to our ability to move forward. I mean, I was telling you earlier about that generation that came before me. They had less reason to be hopeful about ending segregation than I have to be about ending all of these systems and structures that I'm dealing with. I mean, when you think about it, they only knew enslavement and terrorism and segregation. So they had to believe something they had not seen. And that's why I do argue that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice will prevail if hopelessness persists. If we're not willing to believe things we haven't seen, it will not happen, And I do see things. There has been a lot of change. I'm watching these, in Alabama, it's all about college football, right? And, now you see these teams that are dominant, and they're predominantly athletes of color. And it used to be you couldn't have a black quarterback, or you couldn't have this, and you can't. And people want to win enough that they will actually get past all of those things because it advances this community goal of actually prevailing. Right. And I think that has to push us, because if we don't stand up sometimes when people say sit down, if we don't speak when people say, be quiet, we will not prevail. We will not get where we're trying to go. And that's true, I just think, in all walks of life. And that is also part of our heritage and our legacy. I think about all of those extraordinary people that did such incredible things, people in, media and entertainment that had to endure so much while they just represented who they could be. And that's why I feel like, yes, you have to stay hopeful. We built a museum and a memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, is that something we could do? I would say no. If you said something we should do, I would have said no. But we got to the point where I began worrying that we might not win Brown versus Board of Education today. I'm very worried about our courts today. Right. We've created a legal environment where we seem to not take seriously the commitment to equality and anti-discrimination. So that means we have to invest more in this narrative struggle to create that kind of
That's the but people again, where they say, but Oprah, but Barack Obama. I mean, these outliers of excellence, that, yes, extraordinary people can rise extraordinarily. Yeah. But we need a rising tide for all. Yeah. And this system it's not built for it.
Well, it's just people keep looking for shortcuts. They want quick cures. They want to win the Olympics, but they don't want to train. Mm-hmm. They want to be NBA players, but they don't want to practice. They want all of these, and it doesn't work like that. In 2008, everybody was saying, well, you have to stop talking about race. We're post-racial now. I don't even think some of the people who said that then are willing to now say we are post-racial. We are anything but post-racial.
And never were anything.
And never were. Yeah. But that's the thing, is that we, like I said, if you're looking for a shortcut, if you're looking for a quick cure on something that is this kind of entrenched, we're never going to get there, which is why we have to start thinking about this as I think we need an era of truth-telling, an era of truth and justice, era of truth and repair, truth and reconciliation, truth and restoration. And we have to pace ourselves for that, because that's what it's going to take.
I wanted to ask you about Atlanta. Atlanta it still struck me as very segregated in terms of where people were living, but economically it wasn't. Mm-hmm. I spent some time there last year, and I was struck by it's one of the few places I've ever been, one of the few cities I've ever been, where Black economic power and wealth have transformed the social environment around it as well. And it's what made me think about that idea of wealth and equity as the thing that we should focus on rather than equality, because when you get one, suddenly you get the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
And is that something, is that a model that you see, or?
No, I think it is. I mean, I definitely think we have to be talking more about wealth, and we have to be talking more about equity. There's no question about it. But when you think about a city like Atlanta, some of what you see there is the confluence of a lot of things that are unique. You have two leading academic institutions like Morehouse and Spelman, with a rich tradition of Black excellence for women and men that are pushing people out into the world, highly skilled, highly focused, highly dedicated. You've had Black political leadership, not just in the last 10, 15 years, but dating back decades. You have a strong church that has been pushing in some ways. You have entrepreneurs that have been doing extraordinary things. Even people like Tyler Perry in the media spaces.
Creating his own studio and
all of
employing people.
All of that.
Yeah.
And it's
you need control.
And it's just an environment where people are allowed to succeed, allowed to be their best selves. And that's the difference I see in a lot of other places where you're not allowed to do that. You don't have those kinds of long-standing institutions. But no question that wealth and equity have to be part of the equation. We have to create actually a new power dynamic that sees strength and success around these issues.
Do you think that's a scalable model for other cities, or was it really a confluence of just very unique events in that area?
I mean, Atlanta is still a city in the state of Georgia, and it is a very, very continuing struggle, because we see this happening all over the place. I mean, a lot of the things that happen in Atlanta can be undermined by a state government that uses all kinds of policies to. If people in Atlanta feel like they don't get to elect their own officials because their voting is discounted by this kind of contrived manipulation of who
Right.
gets to represent, you'll see things dissipate very quickly. You've got a lot of rural areas in the state of Georgia. So I don't think there's any way you can isolate a community and say we can succeed here and then spread. This whole country has, I guess I'm just unwilling to let anybody in this country off the hook
Right.
from dealing in a fundamental way, in an engaged way, with correcting these problems, with thinking differently, positioning themselves differently when it comes to this history, and ending this tolerance of bigotry and violence and discrimination. I just think there's no other way around it.
And ultimately, maybe you're right that it comes down to without political power, those gains can be too easily pulled back. And that's really been the history, is that each gain, whether it is through what happened in Tulsa or what happened after, 1872, that election where
That's right.
the federal troops left and suddenly everything got pulled back. So without that political power.
That's right.
Yeah.
The Congress was filled with black elected officials in the 1870s. 80-some% of the eligible black voter had been registered to vote. They were participating.
Right.
Then power shifts, politics corrupted. White Southerners take over.
And not happenstance because of it.
That's right.
That was the compromise.
That was it. And so then
Yeah.
you have a century of suffering despite that commitment to education and hard working and democracy. So I don't think we can disengage at any level, at any space. And I think that's I know people want something easy and something that is kind of less difficult. But the truth is our history is hard. Our history is complicated, and we're not going to get to the other side without making that kind of long-term engagement, that long-term commitment. The good news is that it's not a bad thing. It's not an unpleasant thing. It can be affirming. It can be powerful.
You've seen it transform. You've seen it unburden people, and in some ways, it could unburden a nation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have at the end of our museum this thing, and I genuinely believe this. I just think about what would it be like if the children of our children were unburdened by all of this racial conflict and discrimination. What would it feel like for everybody, not just black and brown kids, but for all children to live in a space where they can have beautiful, open relationships with anybody based on their personality and their talents and their characteristics, not based on all of this other stuff? What would it mean if we could use the energy and the resources and the skill and capacity that's now focused on all of this anti-discrimination work and all of the bigotry and injustice on other things? And I think that has to motivate us to get to a different place.
Bryan, it's always such a pleasure to talk to you. And your work is just, it's so inspiring. And I have to tell you, Michael B. Jordan, I thought he doesn't match you handsome wise. I don't know what they were thinking. It's like putting Rodney Dangerfield out. Come on, you're Bryan Stevenson.
It's very. He wanted to get everything right. He was trying to kind of get everything right. And the one thing I did say is like, Michael, man, you don't have to lose the Black Panther body when you play me. You can still look like Creed when you play me in this movie. Nobody went for that, but that was my only thing.
I love it. Well, it's much appreciated, my friend, and thank you.
Thank you too, John.
All the best, and we'll talk to you again soon.